You look beautiful tonight.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here with you.
The lonely billionaire went on a blind date in his friend's place. What he didn't know was that the woman waiting for him had also been switched. And by the time they both realized the truth, walking away was no longer an option. Before we begin, take a moment and comment the city you're watching from. And if you enjoy emotionally charged stories like this, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications because stories like this only get deeper from here. Victoria Thomas stood just inside the entrance of the restaurant, her fingers tightening around the thin strap of her purse as if it were the only thing anchoring her to the floor. The place was beautiful in a way that felt aggressive. Soft golden lights reflected off polished marble floors. Crystal chandeliers hung above tables dressed in white, so crisp they looked ceremonial. The air smelled faintly of truffle oil and money, old money, confident money, the kind that never checked prices. Victoria felt like an intruder. She glanced down at her shoes, clean, sensible, familiar, and resisted the urge to turn around and walk straight back out into the comfort of anonymity. "This is a terrible idea," she muttered. She took one careful step forward, then another, repeating the same lie in her head. "It's just dinner. Be polite. Leave early." She reached up and smoothed the front of her dress, then leaned slightly toward the mirrored wall beside the entrance and checked her reflection. She looked fine. Normal. Calm. She was none of those things. "Maya," she whispered, exhaling slowly. "You owe me for this." An hour earlier, Victoria had been halfway through folding laundry when her phone rang. One look at the caller ID had been enough to make her sigh. Maya never called unless something was wrong. "Vicky, I can't do it," her friend had blurted the second the call connected. Victoria had closed her eyes. "Do what?" "The date. The blind date. I can't go." Victoria leaned against the couch. "Maya, you've been talking about this dinner for 2 weeks. I know, but now that it's actually happening, I feel like I'm about to be interviewed for a job I didn't apply for. It's dinner. Exactly, with a man." Victoria had laughed softly. "You usually like men." "That's not the point." "What is the point?" Maya hesitated. "He sounds intimidating." Victoria had rolled her eyes. "How intimidating can someone be if he agreed to a blind date?" "You don't understand," Maya insisted. "This was set up by a friend of a friend. He's successful, private, apparently very composed. That's a crime now. I don't want to embarrass myself." Silence had stretched between them. Then Maya said, quieter, "Would you go instead?" Victoria had nearly dropped the phone. "What?" "Just this once. Please. Show up, have dinner, be polite. You don't even have to stay long." "Maya, I'll owe you forever." Victoria had stared at the wall, weighing her loyalty against her common sense. She should have said no. She didn't. And now she was here. She scanned the dining room slowly, looking for the reserved table number Maya had texted her at least 6 times. "Table 14. Table 14. Table 14. She spotted it near the window, and then she saw him. He was already seated. Posture straight but not stiff. Dark jacket fitting him like it had been tailored with intention rather than trend. One hand rested loosely on the table, the other adjusted the cuff of his shirt with absent precision. Victoria stopped walking. He wasn't just attractive. He was the kind of handsome that made you pause, reassess, and feel briefly self-conscious about the fact that you had bones. Strong jawline. Calm expression. Eyes focused on nothing in particular, as if he were waiting without impatience. Victoria swallowed. "Okay," she thought. "So Maya panicked over this?" She exhaled slowly, squared her shoulders, and reminded herself why she was here. Be polite. Leave early. She walked toward the table. 3 hours earlier, Richard Gregory had been staring out the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office, wondering how his life had become so full and so empty at the same time. Below him, the city moved like a living thing, cars streaming through intersections, people rushing with purpose, lights flickering on as the evening approached. Above it all, Richard stood alone. His phone buzzed on the desk behind him. He ignored it. It buzzed again. With a sigh, he turned and glanced at the screen. "Ethan, please tell me you're still at the office." Richard frowned. He picked up the phone. "What?" he said, without greeting. "Good," Ethan replied, sounding relieved. "You haven't left yet." "That depends," Richard said slowly. There was a pause. Then, "I need a favor." Richard closed his eyes. "No. You didn't even hear what it is." "I don't need to." "Come on, Rich. Just hear me out." Richard leaned back against the desk, crossing his arms. "You have 10 seconds. "Okay." "I set up a dinner tonight. Important connection. And I can't make it." "Then cancel." "I can't." "Why not?" "Because it would be rude." Richard let out a short laugh. "You've canceled meetings with me before." "That's different." "How?" "Because this one involves feelings." Richard straightened. "Absolutely not." "Just listen," Ethan said quickly. "It's not romantic. It's networking. Social optics. Someone from the circle." Richard rubbed his temple. "You know I don't do this." "I know. That's why I'm asking you." There it was. The silence that followed was heavy. Richard glanced at the time. He had nothing scheduled for the evening, nothing waiting for him at home except an empty penthouse and another quiet night. "How long?" he asked finally. 1 hour. Ethan said immediately. "Eat, talk, leave." Richard stared at his reflection in the glass. The man looking back at him seemed tired. "Fine," he said. 1 hour. "Thank you," Ethan said, relief flooding his voice. "Table 14. The call ended. Richard exhaled and reached for his jacket. Back in the restaurant, Victoria stopped beside the table and offered a polite smile, the one she reserved for meetings, presentations, and situations where she wasn't entirely sure what she was doing. "Hi," she said, pulling out the chair across from him. "I believe this is the blind date?" Richard looked up and frowned. "Blind date?" he repeated. Victoria blinked. "Yes. The dinner that was set up?" Richard's brow furrowed. "I thought this was a networking meeting." They stared at each other. The silence stretched 4 seconds, maybe 5, but it felt longer. "Oh," Victoria said slowly. "That's interesting." Richard leaned back slightly. "Who set this up for you?" "A friend," she said, "who panicked." Richard let out a breath that almost sounded like a laugh. "Same." She studied him more closely now. Noticed the faint tension in his shoulders. The way he held himself like someone used to being in control. "So," she said, "you weren't supposed to be here." "No," he admitted. "And you weren't either." The realization landed between them at the same time. Victoria laughed first. Not a polite laugh. A real one, surprised. Unfiltered. Richard felt something loosen in his chest. "So," she said, wiping at the corner of her eye, "we've both been switched." "That appears to be the case." "We're at the wrong table." "Yes." "With the wrong expectations." "Definitely." She exhaled. "This is a disaster." Richard nodded, objectively. They looked at each other again. The tension shifted. "Well," Richard said after a moment, glancing around the restaurant, "we're already here." Victoria raised an eyebrow. "You're suggesting we pretend this is normal." "I'm suggesting we eat before we flee." She considered him for a second. Then she sat down. "Okay," she said. "But only because I've never eaten in a place like this." Richard smiled. And neither of them realized it yet, but that single decision had already changed everything. The menus arrived like small, leather-bound threats. Victoria picked hers up, scanned the first line, and immediately felt underqualified. She flipped the page, then another. Her brow furrowed, lips moving silently as if sounding out a foreign language. "Okay," she said finally, lowering it to the table with care. "Either I'm underdressed, undereducated, or this menu was written by someone who actively dislikes normal people." Richard glanced at his own menu, which he'd been pretending to read for the last 30 seconds without absorbing a single word. "That bad?" "That bad? Worse," she said. "There's something here called seasonal essence with conceptual garnish." He leaned closer, reading over her shoulder. "Ah. You say that like it explains something." "It doesn't," he admitted, "but it sounds expensive." She laughed, a short, surprised sound, like it had escaped before she could stop it. "Everything here sounds expensive. I'm fairly certain they'd charge extra just for asking questions." The waiter appeared at precisely that moment, pen poised, expression serene in a way that suggested he had witnessed this panic many times before. "May I answer any questions?" he asked. Victoria opened her mouth, then closed it. She glanced at Richard, then back at the waiter. "Yes," she said carefully. "What's the most food-like thing on this menu?" The waiter didn't blink. "The duck is very popular." "Does it taste like duck?" she pressed. Richard bit the inside of his cheek. "Yes," the waiter said, after a pause that suggested deep reflection. "With notes of cherry." Victoria nodded solemnly. "I'll have the duck." "And you, sir?" Richard hesitated. He hadn't looked at the menu in years, not really. He usually let someone else decide. Tonight, he found himself oddly aware of the choice. "I'll have the same," he said. "Excellent," the waiter replied, already writing. "Would you care for wine?" Victoria waved a hand. "Water is fine. Still, nothing fancy." Richard echoed the order. When the waiter disappeared, Victoria exhaled and leaned back in her chair. "Thank you." "For what?" "For not ordering something that would have made me feel like I should have taken a class beforehand." He smiled. "I figured if we were both already out of place, we might as well be out of place together." She studied him for a moment, really studied him. The way he sat comfortably but not arrogantly. The way his smile didn't seem rehearsed. There was a quietness about him that felt intentional. "So," she said, resting her elbows lightly on the table, "since we're apparently strangers sharing a very expensive misunderstanding, what do you do?" "Broad strokes only." He considered the question. "I work too much." She snorted. "That's not a job. It feels like one." "Try again." He tilted his head. "I'm in management." Her eyebrows lifted. "That's vague." "I'm a vague person." She smiled. "Fair enough. I coordinate things." "Things?" "People. Programs. Chaos." She shrugged. "Mostly chaos." He chuckled softly. "Sounds demanding." "It is, but it matters." The way she said it's simple, certain made something shift in his chest. "It does," he said. She seemed surprised by his agreement. "You didn't even ask what it is." "I don't think I need to," he replied. "You wouldn't care this much if it didn't." Her smile softened. For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The clink of glasses and low murmur of the restaurant filled the space between them, but it didn't feel intrusive. It felt comfortable. The water arrived. Then bread, warm, crusty, unapologetically real. Victoria tore off a piece and took a bite. Her eyes widened. "Okay, that's unfair." He laughed. "What is?" "If they can do bread this well, everything else feels like a setup. Lowering expectations?" "Exactly, it's a trap." They ate in companionable silence for a moment, the kind that didn't demand filling. "So, he said eventually. What made you agree to this? Covering for your friend, I mean. She shrugged. She panicked. I didn't want someone sitting alone wondering what they did wrong. That's considerate. She made a face. Or foolish. Those two are often neighbors. She smiled at that. What about you? Why agree to cover for your friend? He hesitated, then answered honestly. I was told it would be good for me. Good for you, how? To interact. She laughed again, longer this time. Interact? Yes. With humans? Apparently. She shook her head, amused. You're doing great so far. No visible malfunctions. He raised his glass in mock salute. High praise. The duck arrived shortly after, plated like art. Victoria stared at it, then looked up at Richard. It's very pretty. It is. I almost don't want to eat it. Almost. She took a bite and closed her eyes briefly. Okay. I take it back. This is worth the confusion. High praise, he echoed. As they ate, the conversation deepened, not dramatically, not all at once, but in gentle layers. They talked about mornings that started too early, about jobs that followed them home, about the strange pressure of expectations, hers to always care, his to always perform. I think people assume I'm stronger than I am, she admitted at one point, tracing the rim of her glass. He nodded. People assume I'm colder than I am. She looked at him. Are you? Sometimes, he said, but not by choice. She considered that. Lonely then. The word hung between them. Yes, he said quietly. She didn't press. She didn't joke. She simply nodded, as if acknowledging something important. Me too, she said. The admission felt bigger than it should have, heavier than the word itself. The waiter cleared their plates, asked about dessert. They both declined without discussion. I think, Victoria said, glancing around the room, this is the part where we're supposed to exchange last names. Is it? Probably. He smiled faintly. We don't have to. She smiled back. No, we don't. They sat there a little longer, neither checking the time, neither eager to leave. Eventually, Richard glanced toward the window. The city lights glowed softly against the glass. We could, he said slowly. Just enjoy the night. Victoria followed his gaze, then looked back at him. No expectations? None. No pretending? Only the kind that makes things easier. She considered it, then nodded. Okay. And for the first time in years, neither of them wanted the night to end. They stayed longer than either of them had planned. Long enough for the restaurant to soften around them, the initial sharpness of nerves giving way to a quieter hum. Long enough for the tables nearby to change occupants. For the staff to glance over with the subtle curiosity reserved for people who looked like they were enjoying themselves without trying. Victoria noticed at first the way the noise had faded into something almost intimate. This place feels different now, she said softly, resting her forearms on the table. Richard followed her gaze. Different how? Less intimidating. Or maybe I've just stopped bracing myself. He smiled. I think that means you're comfortable. The word landed gently, but it carried weight. I don't get comfortable easily, she admitted. Neither do I. That earned him a look curious, thoughtful. She seemed to be deciding something, her fingers tracing the edge of her napkin. So, she said finally, can I tell you something slightly less funny than my inability to read menus? Please, he said. I think we've exhausted the humor quota anyway. She smiled at that, then grew serious. My work, she began. It's more than just a job. He nodded, encouraging her to continue. I help coordinate programs for small businesses and families in a neighborhood just outside the city center. It's not glamorous. It's messy, underfunded, but it's home for a lot of people. The way she spoke, measured, earnest, made him listen differently. We run after-school programs, job training, community events. The kind of things that don't look impressive on paper but keep people afloat. That sounds important, he said. It is, she agreed. Or at least, it feels important, especially lately. He caught the shift immediately. Lately? She sighed, leaning back slightly. There's been pressure. A redevelopment project. His chest tightened. Developers have been buying up land, she continued. Quietly, legally. They're planning luxury housing, retail spaces. You know the type. Yes, he said carefully. I do. They've already pushed out 2 blocks worth of families, she went on. The next phase includes our building. Richard's hand stilled around his glass. They sent notices, she said. Nothing dramatic. Just enough legal language to make it clear they don't expect resistance. Are you resisting? He asked. She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. I don't know how not to. The room seemed to tilt. What company? He asked, keeping his voice steady. She shrugged. Gregory Holdings. Or something close to that. All these corporations blur together after a while. The world stopped. Richard felt it physically, like the air had been sucked from the space between his ribs. His heartbeat thudded loudly in his ears, drowning out the ambient noise of the restaurant. Gregory Holdings. His company. Not a subsidiary. Not a distant partner. His. For a moment, he couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't even blink. He saw it all at once, the contracts he'd signed without reading too closely, the redevelopment proposals approved in batches, the neat summaries presented by people who never mentioned faces, only figures, the building she was talking about, the community she was fighting for. He'd signed off on it months ago. Richard? She said softly. Are you okay? He forced himself to inhale, then exhale. Yes, he said too quickly. I'm fine. She frowned. You went pale. Just didn't expect that, he replied, choosing his words with care. It's complicated. She gave a small, humorless laugh. That's one way to put it. He wanted to tell her. The urge was sharp and immediate, clawing its way up his throat. I'm the one you're fighting. The words sat there, heavy and dangerous. He imagined her expression changing, the warmth cooling, the easy trust evaporating. He imagined her wondering if the entire evening had been a lie. He couldn't do it. Not yet. Have you tried negotiating? He asked instead. She shook her head. They don't negotiate. They send letters. He nodded slowly. There might be alternatives. She studied him. You sound like you've seen this before. I have, he admitted. From the outside. Well, she said quietly, it looks different from here. The waiter appeared then, mercifully unaware of the earthquake that had just split Richard's world in two. May I interest you in dessert? He asked. Victoria glanced at Richard. I think we'll pass. I think we'll pass. As you wish. When the waiter left, the silence returned, but it was different now. Charged. Fragile. I'm sorry, Victoria said suddenly. I didn't mean to unload all that on you. You didn't, Richard replied. I asked. She smiled faintly. Still, it's not exactly first date material. This isn't exactly a first date, he reminded her gently. No, she agreed. It's something else. They sat there a moment longer, neither quite ready to stand. Eventually, Richard checked his watch, not because he wanted to leave, but because staying felt increasingly dishonest. I should go, he said. Her shoulders slumped just a fraction. Me too. Outside, the night air was cool and clean, the city humming softly around them. They stood near the entrance, neither quite sure how to end something that hadn't been defined. Well, Victoria said, breaking the silence. This was unexpected. Yes, he said. In a good way. She hesitated. I'm glad I came. So am I. They looked at each other, the moment stretching thin. Good luck, he said finally, with the redevelopment. She smiled, appreciative. Thank you. I'll need it. They parted then, walking in opposite directions down the sidewalk. Richard didn't look back. He didn't need to. Because as he walked away, one truth echoed louder than the city around him. Richard Gregory walked away knowing one thing. The woman he liked was fighting the company he owned. Richard Gregory did not sleep. He lay awake in the dark of his penthouse, staring at a ceiling so high it felt impersonal, listening to the quiet hum of a city that never quite rested. The glass walls reflected faint ribbons of light from the streets below, headlights, traffic signals, lives moving forward while he remained suspended in the same moment. Gregory Holdings. The words echoed in his mind with an insistence he couldn't silence. He rolled onto his side, then onto his back again. His phone lay face down on the nightstand, untouched. For once, there were no emails demanding attention. No crises waiting to be managed. Just the weight of a realization that refused to soften. He had signed the redevelopment approval in under 2 minutes. 2 minutes to displace families. 2 minutes to erase a community. 2 minutes to threaten the work that mattered most to the woman he'd met by accident. Richard sat up abruptly, the sheets falling away. He swung his legs over the side of the bed and reached for his tablet, fingers moving with the efficiency of habit. The screen lit up instantly, bathing the room in cold light. If he couldn't sleep, he would work. That was what he always did. He pulled up the project file, Urban Revitalization Phase 4, and began scrolling. The document was immaculate. Polished language, clean projections, profit margins outlined in neat columns, renderings of sleek buildings with rooftop gardens and smiling silhouettes that didn't exist yet. He scrolled faster. Environmental impact. Acceptable. Legal clearance. Approved. Community displacement. Mitigated. Mitigated. Richard stopped scrolling. He tapped the word. Pulling up the attached appendix. Pages of legal phrasing unfolded temporary relocation assistance, compensation packages, timelines written in months instead of lives. He closed his eyes. When had he stopped reading these? He remembered a time years ago when he'd pored over every proposal personally, questioning assumptions, challenging numbers, demanding context. Somewhere along the way, growth had demanded delegation. Delegation had demanded trust. And trust had quietly turned into distance. He had told himself it was efficiency. Now it felt like cowardice. Richard leaned back against the headboard, tablet resting uselessly in his lap. His chest felt tight, his thoughts looping back to Victoria's voice. It's home for a lot of people. Not an asset. Not a line item. Home. He stood and crossed the room, barefoot on polished stone floors, stopping at the window. The city looked different tonight, less impressive, more fragile. A grid of light and shadow that depended entirely on decisions made far above ground level. Decisions made by people like him. I didn't see people, he murmured to the glass. I saw paperwork. The words felt like an admission, a confession without absolution. He turned away and went back to the tablet, this time opening the map view attached to the redevelopment file. He zoomed in on the highlighted zone blocks outlined in red, annotated with acquisition dates and demolition schedules. Greenwood District. The name meant nothing to him. That alone felt like an indictment. By the time the sky outside began to pale, Richard had made a decision. He wouldn't call anyone. He wouldn't send an assistant. He wouldn't announce himself. He would go there. The car he chose was unremarkable, no tinted windows, no driver, no emblem that might invite recognition. He dressed simply, dark jeans, a plain jacket, a cap pulled low. He looked like a man on an errand, not a billionaire with questions he was afraid to ask. The drive took less than 20 minutes. The neighborhood announced itself quietly. The buildings were older, closer together, their facades worn but cared for. Murals brightened brick walls. Small shops opened early, metal grates lifting with a groan as owners prepared for the day. A woman swept the sidewalk in front of a cafe, pausing to wave at someone across the street. Richard parked a few blocks away and stepped out into the morning air. It smelled like coffee, like bread, like rain that had fallen overnight. He walked slowly, hands in his pockets, taking in details he'd never seen on a report. A hand-painted sign advertising tutoring services. A chalkboard outside a bookstore announcing a reading that evening. Children laughing somewhere nearby, their voices echoing between buildings. This was the place he had approved for erasure. He followed the map on his phone until he reached the address listed in the redevelopment file. The building stood on the corner, modest, functional, its entrance flanked by posters advertising workshops, job fairs, community meetings. Greenwood Community Center. Richard stopped across the street. The building wasn't impressive by architectural standards. No glass atrium. No dramatic lines. Just brick, windows, and a wide front door that looked like it had been opened and closed thousands of times. He watched people come and go. A man carrying a box of supplies. A woman ushering 2 children inside. One of them tugging at her sleeve with relentless energy. An older couple pausing on the steps, laughing about something only they seemed to understand. Richard's throat tightened. He crossed the street. Inside, the air was warmer. Louder. A bulletin board covered in flyers dominated one wall, layered with announcements and handwritten notes. The space buzzed with quiet activity, voices overlapping, phones ringing, footsteps moving with purpose. No one noticed him. That somehow hurt. He wandered down a hallway, pausing to read signs on doors. Financial literacy workshop. Youth art program. Employment counseling. He pushed open a door at the end of the hall and stepped into a large room filled with long tables and mismatched chairs. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating half-finished art projects scattered across the surfaces. At the center of it all stood Victoria. She was speaking to a small group, 2 teenagers and an older man, gesturing animatedly as she explained something, her expression focused but warm. She wore jeans and a sweater, her hair pulled back loosely, a pen tucked behind one ear. She looked alive. Richard froze, instinctively stepping back into the shadow of the doorway. He hadn't expected to see her. He watched as she laughed at something one of the teenagers said, then leaned forward to correct a line on a sketch. Her movements confident and familiar. This was her world. Not the polished restaurant. Not the careful small talk. The realization landed hard. She wasn't fighting an abstract threat. She was fighting him. Richard backed away quietly, heart pounding. He didn't want her to see him, not yet. Not like this. He continued down the hallway, stepping into another room where a group of adults sat around a table. Papers spread out before them. A woman looked up. "Can I help you?" He hesitated, then nodded. "I'm just looking around." She smiled, unbothered. "Take your time. Coffee's in the back if you want some." "Thank you," he said. He didn't take the coffee. He took in everything else. The cracked tiles that had been repaired instead of replaced. The donated furniture. The careful way people treated the space, not as a charity, but as something earned and shared. This wasn't blight. This was infrastructure. Human infrastructure. By the time he stepped back outside, the sun was fully up. The street was busier now. The neighborhood awake and moving. Richard stood on the sidewalk, the redevelopment map still open on his phone, red outlines mocking him with their simplicity. He zoomed out, then closed the file entirely. He didn't recognize the place, and that terrified him more than anything else. Richard arrived just after noon, when the neighborhood was awake but not yet tired. He parked 2 streets away and walked the rest of the distance, hands in his coat pockets, collar turned up not because it was cold, but because anonymity suddenly felt like a kind of armor. The building stood at the corner like it had always been there. brick worn smooth by decades of weather, windows framed with mismatched curtains, a hand-painted sign near the entrance that read Community Center in cheerful, uneven letters. As if perfection had never been the goal, this was it. He stopped across the street, heart thudding with a strange, unwelcome urgency. On paper, the property was an asset with suboptimal yield. The land value exceeded the building's utility. The numbers had been clear, clean, easy. Standing here, they meant nothing. Children spilled out the front doors in a noisy rush, backpacks bouncing, laughter cutting through the hum of traffic. A woman called after them, reminding them to finish their snacks. A man leaned against the brick wall, handing out flyers and greeting people by name. Richard watched it all like a trespasser. He crossed the street and stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of disinfectant and something warm-baked goods, maybe. The lobby was small but bright, sunlight spilling across scuffed floors. Bulletin boards crowded the walls, layered with flyers for tutoring sessions, job workshops, community dinners. Life. A woman at the front desk glanced up and smiled. "Can I help you?" "Just looking," Richard said quickly. "I was told there was an open house." She nodded without question. "You're welcome to walk around." He nodded his thanks and moved deeper into the building. A classroom to the left held a group of kids clustered around a table, crayons scattered like confetti. A volunteer knelt beside them, offering encouragement as if it were currency. Down the hall, a workshop buzzed with quiet concentration, adults hunched over laptops, a man at the front explaining resume formatting with patient clarity. Richard slowed his steps. This was what hadn't made it into the reports. He'd approved demolitions before, many times. It had never felt personal. Buildings were replaced, people adapted, progress moved forward. That was the narrative. Here, progress looked different. A boy ran past him, nearly colliding with his leg. "Sorry," the boy called, already halfway down the hall. Richard smiled reflexively, then stopped. When was the last time someone had apologized to him without fear? He continued walking, absorbing the details he'd never been shown. The chipped paint on the doorframes, the way people greeted each other with familiarity, with history. This wasn't just a building. It was a meeting place, a refuge, a spine. He turned a corner and froze. Victoria stood in the center of a multi-purpose room, sleeves rolled up, hair pulled back more tightly than it had been at dinner. She was laughing as she handed out papers, voice warm and steady, commanding attention without demanding it. She looked different, not dressed for a restaurant, not carefully composed. She moved with purpose, with ease, like someone exactly where they were meant to be. Richard stepped back instinctively, heart racing. She hadn't seen him. He watched from the doorway as she crouched to speak to a child at eye level, nodding seriously as if the child's concern mattered as much as any boardroom debate. A woman approached her. Voice low, urgent. Victoria listened, then nodded, placing a reassuring hand on the woman's arm. "It'll be okay," she said. "We'll figure it out together." Together. The word landed hard. Richard felt something fracture inside him. This was what he'd reduced to a line item. This woman who laughed at expensive menus, who spoke with quiet conviction, was fighting for this place with everything she had, and he was the reason she had to. He stepped back further, retreating before he could be seen. The last thing he wanted was to intrude, to contaminate the moment with his presence. Outside, the noise of the neighborhood washed over him again. He leaned against the brick wall, breathing deeply, grounding himself in the reality he'd ignored for too long. A man stood nearby, handing out coffee from a thermos to a small group. He offered one to Richard without hesitation. "Free," the man said, smiling. "Community rule." Richard accepted the cup, startled. "Thank you." "No problem," the man replied. "You new around here?" "Yes," Richard said honestly. The man nodded. "Welcome. We're fighting to keep this place, you know." Richard swallowed. I know. Big company wants the land, the man continued. But this place saved my kid. Gave him structure when I couldn't. Richard nodded, throat tight. When the man moved on, Richard stared into the coffee, the steam curling upward like a question he could no longer avoid. He stayed another few minutes, watching life continue around him, feeling the weight of every signature he'd ever placed without reading deeply enough. Then he turned and walked away. He didn't look back. He couldn't, because now he knew. He knew the laughter that would disappear, the doors that would close, the lives that would be uprooted in the name of progress. He knew the faces behind the numbers. And as he reached his car, one truth settled into him with brutal clarity. He now knew exactly what he'd destroy, and exactly who would never forgive him. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday. It was thick, cream-colored, and far too formal for the place it was addressed to. The Greenwood Community Center's name was printed in clean, authoritative lettering, followed by an address Victoria could have written from memory in the dark. She noticed it the moment she unlocked the front door. It sat on the welcome desk like an accusation. Victoria set her bag down slowly. The building was quiet at that hour, too early for the after-school rush, too late for the morning programs. Sunlight slanted through the front windows, catching dust in the air, illuminating the scuffed floors and the faded mural on the far wall. She stared at the envelope longer than necessary. Her chest tightened, the familiar instinct to delay bad news rising like a reflex. If she didn't open it, it didn't exist. If it didn't exist, she could get through the morning, make coffee, check schedules, pretend the ground wasn't shifting beneath her feet. But she already knew. She picked it up. The paper was heavier than it needed to be, expensive, official. It felt wrong in her hands, like something that belonged somewhere else, somewhere colder. Victoria slit the envelope open with a letter opener she'd had since her first week at Greenwood. Inside, the pages were neatly stacked, clipped together with a precision that suggested confidence. Notice of demolition and vacate order. The words blurred for a moment. She sat down hard in the chair behind the desk, the sound echoing in the empty lobby. Her eyes moved over the page, skimming at first, then slowing as the reality set in. Dates. Deadlines. Legal language designed to sound reasonable while leaving no room for negotiation. They were being given 60 days. 60 days to dismantle years of work. 60 days to displace programs, people, lives. 60 days to disappear quietly. Victoria's hands began to shake. She pressed her lips together, willing herself to breathe, to stay steady. She had handled bad news before. Funding cuts, program cancellations, staff shortages. This was just bigger. Too big. Her vision blurred. She blinked hard, but the tears came anyway, hot and sudden, spilling over before she could stop them. She bent forward, elbows on the desk, the papers crumpling slightly beneath her fingers. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no." The sound of her own voice broke something open. She cried then, not dramatically, not loudly. Just quietly, shoulders shaking, grief spilling out in a way that surprised her with its force. She thought of the kids who came every afternoon because this was the one place they felt safe. The seniors who treated Wednesday lunches like sacred rituals. The small business owners who had learned how to keep going in rooms that smelled faintly of coffee and hope. She thought of the mural on the wall, of the scuffed floors, of the building that had held more lives than its square footage suggested, and she let herself break. It didn't last long. It never did. Victoria wiped her face with the back of her hand, breathing deeply until the shaking eased. She straightened, smoothing the papers out in front of her, forcing her mind back into motion. Crying was allowed. Stopping was not. She read the notice again, this time carefully. Line by line. Clause by clause. Her jaw tightened as she reached the final page. At the bottom, almost as an afterthought, was a single paragraph she hadn't expected. A public hearing will be held to address community concerns and redevelopment proposals. A date followed. Victoria's breath caught. A hearing meant a chance. Not a good one. Not a fair one. But a chance. All the same. She folded the papers neatly, slid them back into the envelope, and stood. The building felt different now, not doomed but challenged, like a body bracing for impact. She walked the halls with new eyes, noting what would need documentation, what stories needed telling. She stopped in front of the mural and traced a finger along a painted line. "Okay," she murmured. "If this is happening, then we fight." Across the city, Richard Gregory sat at the head of a long conference table, hands clasped tightly in front of him. The boardroom was immaculate, glass walls, minimalist art, a view that framed the skyline like a promise. He felt none of it. The agenda glowed on the screen behind him, bullet points marching forward with ruthless efficiency. Urban revitalization. Phase 4 sat neatly between two other projects, reduced to a line item like any other. Richard cleared his throat. "I want to revisit Greenwood," he said. A few heads turned. Some eyebrows lifted. One of the board members, a man who had been with the company nearly as long as Richard, leaned back in his chair. "We've already approved that." "I know," Richard replied. "I'm asking us to reconsider." There was a pause. Not shocked. Not angry. Just measured. "Is there a problem?" another member asked. "Yes," Richard said. The impact assessment was incomplete. A woman across the table tapped her pen lightly. "We followed protocol." "Protocol isn't the same as understanding," Richard said, his voice calm but firm. "There's a community center at the heart of that project. It serves hundreds of people." "That's unfortunate," someone said. "But redevelopment always has casualties." The word landed like a slap. Richard's jaw tightened. "They're not casualties. They're people." A few members exchanged looks. "We can offer additional relocation support," the chairman said evenly. "But pulling out now would be costly." "I'm aware of the cost," Richard replied. "I'm also aware of the cost of proceeding." Silence followed. Finally, the chairman leaned forward. "Richard, with all due respect, this project aligns with our long-term strategy. We can't halt progress because of sentiment." Richard stared at him. "Progress for whom?" The answer was unspoken. The vote was quick, efficient, final. The project stood. Richard leaned back in his chair as the meeting moved on, a familiar sense of control slipping through his fingers. He had underestimated how deeply the decision had already been set in motion. He had assumed his position would be enough. It wasn't. When the meeting adjourned, he stayed seated, watching the board members file out with polite nods and murmured goodbyes. The room emptied, leaving him alone with the glass walls and the view he suddenly despised. He pulled out his phone, scrolling without purpose until he found the address he already knew by heart. Greenwood Community Center. He pictured the bulletin board, the cracked tiles, the way Victoria's face lit up when she spoke about the work. She would have received the notice by now. The thought made his chest ache. Victoria stood at the front of the main room that evening. A small crowd gathered around her. The envelope lay open on the table beside her. Its contents spread out for everyone to see. Murmurs filled the air. "They can't do this." "They can." 60 days? "We won't make it." Victoria raised her hands, quieting the room. "They're not wrong," she said, her voice steady despite the weight pressing on her chest. "They can do this." The room fell silent. "But," she continued, "they don't get to do it quietly." Heads lifted. "There's a public hearing," she said, "and we're going to be there." Something shifted. "We'll gather impact statements," she went on. "Photos, testimonials, data. We'll show them what this place means." "And if they don't listen?" someone asked. Victoria met their eyes. "Then we make them listen." Applause broke out, not loud, not triumphant, but determined. Later, when the building was empty again, Victoria sat alone at her desk, papers spread out in careful stacks. She felt tired down to her bones, but beneath it all burned a familiar resolve. She thought of the man from the restaurant, the quiet intensity in his eyes, the way he'd listened. She pushed the thought aside. This wasn't about romance, or coincidence, or chance meetings in elegant rooms. This was about survival. Across the city, Richard stood by his window, phone in hand, knowing the same truth with brutal clarity. Love wouldn't be enough. This would require war. City Hall had never felt so large. Victoria stood at the base of the wide stone steps, clutching a folder so tightly her fingers ached. The building loomed above her columns, rising like indifferent sentinels, windows reflecting a gray sky that matched her mood far too well. People streamed past her in small clusters, voices overlapping, tension thick in the air. Some wore suits, others wore worn jackets and determination. Cameras hovered at the edges. Reporters murmuring into microphones, their attention flicking between faces like predators searching for the sharpest angle. This was it. She took a breath and climbed the steps. Inside, the hall buzzed with noise. The main chamber was already filling rows of wooden benches packed with community members, advocates, city officials, and representatives from Gregory Holdings. The corporate side sat together, composed and polished, papers stacked neatly in front of them like shields. Victoria felt suddenly, painfully small. She found a seat near the front with a few people from the center. Mrs. Alvarez squeezed her hand. A teenager she recognized from the art program gave her a tight smile, eyes wide with a mix of fear and hope. "You've got this," someone whispered. Victoria nodded, though her stomach twisted. The gavel struck. The room quieted. The council chair cleared his throat and began the proceedings, his voice formal, detached. Agenda items rolled by permits, zoning adjustments, infrastructure updates each one another, reminder of how easily lives could be rearranged with the right language. Then it was time. "Next," the chair announced, "we will hear public comment regarding the proposed redevelopment of the Greenwood district." A murmur rippled through the room. Victoria stood. For a moment, the world narrowed to the sound of her own heartbeat. She walked to the podium, every step heavy with the weight of expectation. She placed her folder down, adjusted the microphone, and looked out at the faces before her. Some curious, some bored, some already decided. She took a breath. "My name is Victoria," she began, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "And I coordinate the Greenwood Community Center." She paused, letting the words settle. "For years, that building has been more than a structure. It's been a lifeline, a place where children finish homework because there's nowhere else quiet enough to do it, where seniors come not just for meals but for company, where small business owners learn how to survive when the odds are stacked against them." She looked directly at the council members now. "The redevelopment proposal describes our neighborhood as underutilized, but I'm here to tell you it's fully alive." A few heads lifted. Victoria continued, drawing strength from the faces behind her. "When you talk about progress, you talk about numbers. Profit margins, square footage, tax revenue. But when you erase a place like Greenwood, you erase relationships. You erase stability. You erase years of investment that didn't come from money but from people." She opened her folder and held up a photograph. "This is Marcus," she said. "He started coming to the center when he was 9. He's graduating next month, first in his family." Another photo, another name, another story. The room grew quieter. "We're not asking you to stop development," she said. "We're asking you to see us, to work with us, to understand that progress doesn't have to mean displacement." Her voice faltered just slightly, emotion pressing at the edges. "If you take this building, you don't just take brick and mortar. You take a future that hundreds of people are still building." She stepped back from the microphone. Silence followed, thick, expectant. Then polite applause. Scattered. "Careful." The council chair nodded. "Thank you for your comments. Victoria returned to her seat, heart pounding. She searched the faces of the officials, hoping for something, anything that suggested she'd reached them. The first corporate representative stood. He was calm, well-spoken, dressed in a suit that probably cost more than the community center's annual maintenance budget. "We appreciate the passion displayed today," he said smoothly. "However, redevelopment is essential for the city's growth. Our proposal includes relocation, assistance, and economic opportunities that will benefit the area as a whole." Victoria's chest tightened. Another representative followed. More assurances, more polished language, more distance. "The emotional testimony is compelling," one said, almost kindly. "But decisions must be made with the city's long-term interests in mind." A council member nodded. Change is never easy. Hope began to thin. Victoria felt it slipping, draining from the room as the conversation turned procedural. Motions were discussed, timelines referenced, the words blurred together, hollow and relentless. Mrs. Alvarez squeezed her hand again, harder this time. Victoria swallowed, fighting the rising ache in her throat. Had it all been for nothing? The chair raised his gavel. "Unless there are further comments, we will proceed." The doors at the back of the chamber opened. Every head turned. The sound echoed through the room, sharp and unmistakable, cutting through the murmurs like a blade. Victoria looked up and froze. Then the doors opened. The doors at the back of the chamber swung open. The sound cut through the room like a fault line splitting stone. Victoria turned slowly, her pulse roaring in her ears, expecting a late council member or another attorney rushing in with documents. What she saw instead made her breath catch painfully in her chest. Richard Gregory stepped inside. Not the quiet man from the restaurant. Not the attentive stranger who had listened more than he spoke. This Richard moved with unmistakable authority. He wore a dark suit, tailored with the kind of precision that didn't try to impress it assumed recognition. His expression was calm, but there was tension in his jaw, resolve etched into every measured step as he walked down the aisle. A ripple of murmurs spread across the chamber. Whispers followed him like a tide. "That's him." "Is that Gregory?" Victoria's mind struggled to catch up. Her heart sank. The recognition hit her all at once, his composure, his restraint, the way he'd never once flinched at the price of dinner. The shadow that had crossed his face when she'd mentioned the company's name. No. Richard reached the front of the room just as the council chair lifted his gavel again. "Sir," the chair said sharply. "These proceedings are—" "My name is Richard Gregory," Richard said, his voice carrying easily through the chamber. "And I believe I need to speak." The room went silent. Victoria felt the blood drain from her face. The council chair hesitated, then nodded slowly. "You have the floor." Richard turned not toward the council first, but toward the packed benches. Toward the people who had come to defend a building most of the city barely acknowledged. "I'm the CEO of Gregory Holdings," he said plainly. Gasps rippled outward. Victoria's hands clenched in her lap. "I approved the Greenwood redevelopment project," he continued. "I signed the documents. I authorized the timelines." Every word landed like a stone dropped into water. "I did it without ever setting foot in the neighborhood, without ever speaking to the people whose lives would be disrupted." He paused. "That was my failure." The chamber was utterly still now. Richard faced the council. "You've heard arguments today about progress, about economics, about what's best for the city." He shook his head slightly. "What you haven't heard is accountability." A board member stood abruptly. "Richard, this is highly irregular." "I'm aware," Richard said calmly. "But so is approving the erasure of a community without understanding it." He turned back to the room. "I visited Greenwood. Quietly, without announcement. I walked the streets, spoke to residents, saw the center at work." His gaze flicked just once to Victoria. She couldn't look away. "The redevelopment proposal describes the area as underutilized," he said. That assessment is wrong. A murmur spread. That community center is not blight. Richard continued. It's infrastructure. Human infrastructure. And destroying it would not be progress, it would be negligence. The board member stepped forward again. This project has already been approved. Any reversal would require— I'm not asking for permission, Richard said evenly. The words landed like a thunderclap. I'm invoking executive authority. The chamber erupted. Voices overlapped. Reporters surged forward. The council chair pounded the gavel, calling for order. Richard waited. When the noise finally subsided, he spoke again. Effective immediately, Gregory Holdings is withdrawing from the Greenwood redevelopment project. Victoria's breath hitched. We will not pursue demolition of the Greenwood Community Center, Richard continued. Instead, the company will fund its renovation, expansion, and long-term protection under a legally binding agreement. Someone in the crowd sobbed. Richard wasn't finished. We will also establish a community advisory board comprised of Greenwood residents to ensure no future development proceeds without direct local input. The board members looked stunned, furious, powerless. Richard turned to the council. The necessary paperwork will be filed today. Our legal team is prepared. Silence followed thick, disbelieving. The council chair cleared his throat. This changes the scope of the proposal. Yes, Richard said simply. That's the point. Victoria sat frozen, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain everyone could hear it. The man she'd laughed with over mispronounced menu items stood at the center of the room, dismantling a machine he himself had built. The villain had stepped forward and undone everything. The council chair adjourned the session amid chaos. People surged toward Richard, reporters shouting questions, community members thanking him through tears. Victoria didn't move. She couldn't. Her world had tilted too violently. Richard finally broke free and found her in the crowd. Their eyes met. For a moment, everything else faded, the noise, the cameras, the history rewriting itself around them. I didn't lie about caring, he said quietly, standing close enough that only she could hear. But I should have told you who I was. Her throat tightened. You were the company, she said, voice barely steady. The one we were fighting. Yes. And you let me talk about it, she continued. You let me think you were just someone else. I know, he said. And I'll carry that. She searched his face, looking for excuses, for justifications. There were none. I didn't do this for forgiveness, Richard added. I did it because it was right. Victoria nodded slowly. I don't know what this means, she said. He didn't reach for her, didn't crowd her space. Neither do I, he replied. But I know it doesn't erase the lie. Around them, the room buzzed with relief and celebration. Greenwood had been saved. But between them, something fragile hung in the balance. As Richard stepped back, giving her space, one truth settled heavily between them. The villain had just saved the story. But love doesn't reset that easily. They didn't speak at first. The chamber had emptied in waves, reporters chasing quotes, council members retreating into offices, community members lingering in small knots of disbelief and relief. The air still vibrated with the aftershock of what had just happened. Victoria stood near a side hallway, the folder still tucked under her arm like a shield she no longer needed. Richard approached slowly, careful not to crowd her. He looked different now, not because of the suit or the attention, but because the weight he carried was visible. Exposed. Can we talk? He asked. She didn't answer right away. She took a breath, then another, grounding herself in the feel of the marble floor beneath her shoes. Yes, she said finally. But not here. They found an empty conference room down the hall, glass walls, a long table, chairs arranged with sterile precision. The door closed softly behind them, sealing out the noise. For a moment, they stood on opposite sides of the table. Victoria set her folder down and folded her arms, not defensively, but deliberately. "You should start," she said. Richard nodded. "I didn't tell you who I was," he said. "I should have." "That's not the same thing as didn't," she replied quietly. He didn't argue. "I let you talk," she continued. "About the center. About the company. I watched you carry the weight of something I caused, and I said nothing. Yes." "Why?" Her voice didn't rise. It didn't crack. That almost made it worse. He exhaled. "Because I was afraid," he said. "Afraid you'd look at me and only see the harm. Afraid I'd lose the chance to do the right thing before I earned it." Victoria studied him. Eyes sharp but tired. "So you decided the truth could wait." "I decided I needed to understand first," he said. "And then I needed to fix it." She shook her head slowly. "You don't get to decide when someone else deserves honesty." "I know." The admission landed without drama, without defense. "That night," she said, "I trusted you. Not because you were impressive, but because you were kind. Because you listened. Because you felt safe." Her voice softened on the last word, then steadied again. "And the whole time you were standing on the other side of the fight." "Yes," Richard said. "And that's on me." She turned away, walking to the window, staring out at the city. The skyline looked different now, less abstract, more accountable. "You saved the center," she said. "You didn't have to." "I did," he replied. "I absolutely had to." She nodded. "I believe that." He blinked. "You do?" "I believe your actions today," she said. "I don't believe they erase what came before." He accepted that without flinching. "That's fair." She turned back to face him. "I'm not angry because you're powerful," she said. "I'm angry because you were silent when it mattered most." He met her gaze. "I won't be silent again." "Good," she said, "because I won't let you be." The words surprised them both. She took a breath. "Greenwood will need follow-through. Oversight. Transparency. I'll provide all of that. And distance," she added, "at least for now." Richard nodded immediately. "Whatever you need." She hesitated, then continued. "We can work together. Professionally. For the center. For the community." He waited. "But that's it," she finished. "No blurred lines. No assumptions. Not until trust is rebuilt." Something flickered across his face. Disappointment, yes. But also respect. "I understand," he said, "and I agree." The tension eased slightly, replaced by something quieter. More honest. They stood there, the space between them no longer charged with illusion, but with possibility that had to be earned. Outside the glass walls, life resumed its rhythm. Phones rang, footsteps echoed. The world moved forward. Victoria picked up her folder. "We have work to do." Richard stepped aside, opening the door for her. "We do." She paused at the threshold, glancing back once. "This doesn't make us anything," she said. "Not yet." He met her eyes. "I know." She left the room without another word. Richard remained behind for a moment, resting his hands on the back of a chair, breathing through the ache in his chest. He had done the right thing and paid the price for the lie that came before it. Trust had been broken, but as he watched Victoria walk down the hall, steady, resolute, unafraid, he knew one thing with equal certainty. It wasn't beyond repair. The first planning meeting took place 3 days later. Victoria arrived early, as she always did, spreading blueprints across the long table in the Greenwood Community Center's main room. The smell of fresh coffee drifted through the air, mingling with the familiar hum of a building that refused to feel temporary, no matter how close it had come to disappearing. She adjusted a stack of folders, aligning edges that didn't need aligning. It was easier than thinking about who would be walking through the door. When Richard arrived, he didn't announce himself. He paused at the threshold, taking in the room, the tables scarred with use, the walls marked by years of community projects. Then he stepped inside quietly, sleeves rolled up, jacket draped over one arm. "Morning," he said. Victoria looked up. "You're early." "So are you." She nodded, gesturing to the table. "We'll start with structural repairs. Roof first. Then accessibility." Richard set his jacket aside and leaned over the plans without comment, scanning them with a focus that surprised her. He didn't interrupt, didn't offer solutions prematurely. He listened. That, she noticed, mattered. As others filtered in volunteers, city liaisons, a representative from the construction firm, the room filled with voices and movement. The atmosphere was cautious but hopeful, like a group learning how to breathe again after a near miss. Richard's assistant, a woman named Claire, took notes with efficient precision. She glanced between Victoria and Richard more than once, curiosity flickering across her face. But she said nothing. The meeting unfolded with professional rhythm. Victoria led. Richard supported. When disagreements arose about timelines, budgets, feasibility, they were addressed calmly, without ego. Richard deferred when appropriate. Victoria conceded when logic demanded it. There was tension, yes, but it was the kind that sharpened rather than burned. At one point, a contractor pointed to a section of the blueprint. This wall would need to come down for the new wing. Victoria stiffened. "That wall holds the mural." Richard glanced at her. "The one in the lobby?" "Yes." He turned back to the contractor. "Then the wall stays." The contractor hesitated. "It would increase costs." Richard didn't waver. "Then we increase the budget." Victoria met his gaze briefly, something unspoken passing between them. Respect. After the meeting adjourned, the room emptied slowly. Volunteers lingered, energized by the sense of momentum. Mrs. Alvarez pressed a plate of pastries into Richard's hands with a smile. "You saved our home," she said simply. Richard swallowed. "I helped correct a mistake." She patted his arm. "That counts." When she left, Victoria gathered her papers, stacking them neatly. Richard watched her for a moment before speaking. "You handled that well," he said. She shrugged. "I've been doing this a long time. I can tell." The compliment wasn't grand. It didn't need to be. They spent the next week working in close proximity. Emails turned into conversations. Conversations turned into shared problem-solving. They walked the building together, discussing repairs and possibilities, pointing out flaws and strengths with equal honesty. They kept things professional, careful, but familiarity has a way of sneaking in. One afternoon, as they stood in the lobby staring up at the cracked ceiling, Richard said, "You know, I used to want to be an architect." Victoria glanced at him. "Really?" "Yes. Designing spaces that made people feel welcome." She smiled faintly. "You still can." He met her eyes. "Maybe I am." They shared a quiet laugh. At lunch, they sat across from each other at a small table near the windows, eating sandwiches wrapped in paper instead of plated artfully. "This is better," Victoria said, taking a bite. Richard nodded. "No concept foam." She laughed, then caught herself, the sound fading as quickly as it came. Boundaries reasserted themselves. They didn't talk about the night at the restaurant, or the moment in City Hall when everything changed. They spoke around those memories, careful not to step too close. But chemistry doesn't disappear just because it's inconvenient. It surfaced in small ways, the way Richard remembered how she took her coffee, the way Victoria noticed when he skipped meals and wordlessly slid a granola bar across the table. Once, late in the evening, they found themselves alone in the building, the last volunteers having gone home. The lights hummed softly overhead. "This place feels different already," Richard said. Victoria nodded. "It does." They stood side by side, looking out the front windows at the street beyond. For a moment, the silence stretched, not awkward, but heavy with everything unsaid. Richard shifted slightly, then stopped himself from speaking. Victoria felt it, the pull, the question, the possibility, and chose restraint. "Tomorrow," she said quietly, "we'll review the community feedback." He nodded. "Tomorrow." They parted ways again, each carrying the same unspoken truth. Working together was easy. Pretending nothing else existed was not, and with every shared plan, every quiet laugh, every moment of mutual respect, the distance they'd carefully maintained grew thinner. The closer they worked, the harder it became to pretend. The first headline appeared on a Friday morning. Victoria saw it while waiting for her coffee, her phone balanced against a stack of folders at the front desk. Gregory Holdings CEO halts major redevelopment board divided. She stared at the screen longer than she meant to. By noon, there were 5 more. Speculation bloomed like wildfire. Analysts debated motives. Commentators questioned Richard's judgment. Anonymous sources whispered about internal conflict, about pressure, about weakness disguised as morality. By the end of the day, the story had found its favorite angle. Was this a strategic move? Or a personal one? Victoria felt the weight of it settle into her chest. The Greenwood Community Center buzzed with activity renovation plans moving forward. Volunteers energized. Optimism cautiously blooming, but beneath it all ran a current of tension that hadn't been there before. Richard felt it too. The board meeting that afternoon was brutal. They sat around the long table. Faces tight. Voices clipped. The chairman didn't bother with pleasantries. "You blindsided us," he said flatly. Richard didn't flinch. "I corrected a mistake." "You undermined months of planning," another board member snapped. "And now the media is circling." "That was inevitable," Richard replied. "Transparency always invites scrutiny." "Transparency?" Someone scoffed. "You made a unilateral decision based on what? A site visit?" "Based on responsibility," Richard said evenly, "which we all share." The chairman leaned forward. "Your reputation is tied to this company. If the narrative turns against you, then let it," Richard interrupted. The room fell silent. "I won't hide behind ambiguity to protect myself." The meeting ended without resolution. Richard left knowing the next move was his. Victoria found him that evening in the main room, standing alone beneath the half-repaired ceiling. Blueprints lay spread across a table, untouched. "You're trending," she said quietly. He smiled faintly. "I was afraid of that." She set her bag down. "They're asking questions. About motives." "Yes. About us." That made him look at her. "Is that a problem?" He asked gently. She hesitated. "It could be. For the center. For your position." "For you?" She crossed her arms, more to steady herself than to create distance. "I've spent my life watching powerful people make promises they didn't keep. Watching communities trust and lose." He nodded slowly. "And you're afraid trusting me makes you complicit?" "Yes." The honesty hung between them, fragile and sharp. "I won't ask you to trust me," Richard said. "Not blindly. Not ever." She searched his face. "Then what are you asking?" He took a breath. "That you let me be honest. Fully." He reached into his jacket and pulled out his phone, scrolling briefly before turning the screen toward her. An email draft filled the display. "I'm releasing a statement tonight," he said. "Clarifying everything. Why I stopped the project. Why Greenwood matters. Why this isn't strategy, it's accountability." "And the board?" she asked. "They'll be furious." "And your reputation?" He shrugged. "I'll survive." She studied him, something shifting behind her eyes. "You don't have to do this." "I do," he said simply, "because half-truths are what got us here." Silence settled around them. Victoria looked away, pacing slowly. I don't know how to do this, she admitted. Trust someone who has the power to take everything away. Richard didn't follow her. He let her move. You don't owe me trust, he said. And you don't owe me anything else either. She stopped, turned back to him. Then why does this feel like more than work? She asked quietly. He met her gaze. Because it is. The words landed without flourish, without demand. I care about you, Richard said. Not because of what you represent, not because of Greenwood, but because of who you are when no one is watching. Her throat tightened. I'm not asking for anything in return, he continued. No forgiveness. No promise. I just didn't want to hide anymore. Victoria closed her eyes briefly, breathing through the storm of emotion rising in her chest. When she opened them again, her voice was steady. I'm afraid, she said, of wanting this, of believing it, of losing myself in someone else's power. Richard stepped closer but stopped short of touching her. Then let this be equal, he said, or let it be nothing. She held his gaze, searching for cracks, for leverage, for manipulation. There was none. Okay, she said softly. Not a commitment, not a surrender, an opening. Outside, the city lights flickered on, the world continuing its relentless pace. Inside the community center, two people stood on the edge of something they could no longer deny. Love finally stepped out of hiding. The ribbon was green. Victoria noticed that, first, the deliberate choice. The quiet symbolism. Not red. Not flashy. Green. Like renewal. Like something allowed to grow back stronger after being cut too close to the root. She stood just inside the front doors of the Greenwood Community Center, fingers resting lightly against the brick wall that had been scrubbed clean but never smoothed over. The cracks were still there. They'd decided to keep them. History mattered. Sunlight poured through the refurbished windows, brighter now, warmer. The lobby smelled faintly of fresh paint and coffee. The comforting kind burnt just enough to feel familiar. Voices filled the space, overlapping in laughter and greeting. A hum of life reclaiming itself. The center was reopening. Not as a miracle, not as a rescue story, as a decision that had been fought for and earned. Victoria stepped forward as the crowd gathered. Children tugged at their parents' hands, pointing excitedly at the updated rooms. Seniors claimed seats like they always had, smiling knowingly, as if they'd never doubted this day would come. Richard stood off to the side, deliberately unobtrusive. No podium, no speech prepared in advance, no attempt to center himself in a story that was never meant to be about him. Claire leaned over and murmured, "You're doing the right thing." He nodded. "I know." When the brief ceremony began, Victoria spoke first. She didn't read from notes. "This building almost disappeared," she said simply. Not because it wasn't needed, but because someone decided it wasn't visible enough. A murmur rippled through the crowd. "Today," she continued, "it stands here not because one person saved it, but because a community refused to be erased." Applause followed. Real applause. The kind that carried weight. She gestured toward Richard, then not dramatically, but honestly, and because accountability finally met power. Richard stepped forward, heart steady, eyes clear. "I won't pretend this story started today," he said, "or that it ends here." A few people nodded. "I was part of the problem," he continued, "and being honest about that doesn't make me noble, it makes me responsible." He paused, then added, "Greenwood doesn't need a savior. It needs partners." He stepped back. That was it. No thunderous declarations, no promises wrapped in grandeur, just truth. Later, as the crowd thinned and the building settled into its new rhythm, Victoria and Richard walked the halls together. Side by side, they stopped in the art room, where a new mural stretched across the wall, bright colors layered over the old design, honoring it without erasing it. "It feels Right, Victoria said. It does, Richard agreed. And different. She glanced at him. Different how? He smiled faintly. Like we're not pretending anymore. They reached the front windows, watching people come and go. The neighborhood moved around them, unchanged in the ways that mattered most. I won't disappear after this, Richard said. But I won't control it either. Victoria nodded. And I won't measure you by your power. She hesitated, then added, only by your choices. He met her gaze. That's fair. They didn't rush anything after that. No sudden declarations. No cinematic kiss. No illusion that love erased complexity. They built something slower. Shared leadership meant shared disagreements. Planning meetings still ran long. Trust still required maintenance. Some days were easier than others, but the rules were clear now. No secrets. No leverage. No pretending. One evening, long after the last light had been turned off, they stood outside the center beneath the quiet sky. We really were switched, Victoria said softly. Richard smiled. For a while, she reached for his hand not as a promise but as a choice. Not anymore. He laced his fingers with hers. Two people who stopped pretending. Two lives no longer switched. A choice made together. And if this story moved you, take a moment to like it, subscribe, turn on your notifications, and comment the city you're watching from. It helps us bring you more unforgettable stories.